Yeah, I'm Daniel Burns. I teach political philosophy here at the University of Dallas. This will be my fourth summer teaching Hertog. I got my undergraduate at Williams College in the beautiful Berkshires and my doctorate at Boston College back in 2012. I've been teaching at University of Dallas ever since. Teaching for Hertog is a lot of fun. I do want to say that it's a real treat to be with students who are all there because they want to do all the reading and want to talk about all the reading and are excited about talking about all the reading and don't have to be there and aren't there to get a degree, but are there because they love reading these books and talking about them with other smart students in Washington, D.C. So the level of motivation, I have to say, is really unique among any teaching experience that I have had or have heard of or that any of my friends have had. It's really astonishing and just wonderful that I get into class at 8:30 ready to talk to these students, and they have already been arguing about the books for half an hour with each other on their way from the dorms. It's a real treat, and it's exactly what I think the college admissions brochures told you that all of college was going to be like. And some of you would probably find that not all of college is actually like that all the time, but Hertog is like that all the time. It's really fantastic. I tell all my friends if I were independently wealthy and could just teach Hertog all the time, I would do it for free. Yeah, so this is a really exciting course. I had a lot of fun teaching it last year, and the students really took to it as well. So Alexis de Tocqueville, as some of you may have heard, is this Frenchman who came and visited the U.S. in the 1820s. He really occupies a unique position in the history of American political thought, insofar as almost everybody who reads him nowadays agrees that he's the best observer of what this country is like and how it works ever. He's done it better than any American has ever done it. He's often taught in classes on American political thought, even though he's not an American. And with that motivation and that really amazing outsider's perspective that just let him notice all kinds of things about this country that people who grow up and live here are less likely to notice. That and just an incredible mind and an amazing education all together allowed him to write this book that people to this day pick up this book. Americans read it for the first time and say, how does this guy know so much about me and my friends? And he wrote it 200 years ago. So it's not that everything in the book is as true today as it was when he observed it about America 200 years ago. That's one of the things we talk about in the class. But a lot is. And it's for the students to figure out to what extent they think it applies and it doesn't. But most people who read Tocqueville are amazed at his insight into how this country works, how its political system works, and also, and this is a particularly Tocquevillian theme that we spend a lot of time talking about in the class, what is the relationship between our political system on the one hand and a bunch of other things about our country that aren't technically part of our political system, but that seem, to Tocqueville at least, essential to making the political system run. So he talks, for example, we start by just doing his description of the American way of government, the system of government, the Constitution for federal and state levels, which for him is not so much about what it says on paper, although he talks a little bit about what it says on paper, but he's especially interested in how it actually works once you get it up and running. So, for example, he talks a lot about how important the American court system is, which is not obvious from the text of the federal Constitution, that the American courts, especially the federal courts, would have so much power in determining the shape of our country and our way of life. But he sees that they do, and he talks about why they do and how they do. Talks about what kind of power the president has, not just on paper, but as it's actually exercised. And so he's very interested in what makes the system tick just on a political level. And then he goes a step deeper and he talks about, what actually, what are the most important forces moving American politics, public opinion, for example. Now, that's nowhere in the Constitution, but it's essential to how our country actually works in practice. He talks about American religion, which he says has enormous influence over American politics, despite, or he argues in a way, because of the very fact that we have separation of church and state in a way that most European countries didn't at the time. He says it's actually part of what makes American religion powerful in the unique way that American religion is powerful. And he says it's a huge political force. Why is that and how does that actually work? And then for all these things, as he's observing, his main goal is just to see how it works. But he says, I also wanted to draw lessons. So he's talking about he's making his own judgment system, which of these things work well, which of them could be improved. What are the dangers or disadvantages of the American system of government? He makes the kind of famous and striking claim that there's less freedom of thought in the U.S., despite its freedom of freedom of press and freedom of speech, less freedom of thought in the U.S. than in any other country in the world. This is this very provocative claim. He says, I know Americans won't like to hear this, but I'll tell you why I think it's true. So we go through, we read all this, students debate to what extent they think he's right about these things, to what extent his insights apply today, what it would mean to apply some of his insights today. He talks about American family structure. Obviously, family structure has changed a lot in the past 200 years, but does he have anything to say that's relevant to our very different modern conditions? So it's a big book. We don't have time to read all of it in the week, but we keep up a good pace, and we get through, I would say, almost all of the biggest themes that are relevant to his understanding of American politics. We touch on, so for example, he's got some amazing observations about American art and literature, fine arts. Those are great. We don't read those. They're fascinating, but they're not really about politics. But other things he says about the military, about the future of American military, about the threat that military rule has posed to other democracies, and whether and to what extent Americans can avoid that. All sorts of really fascinating predictions that he makes, again, about the characteristic advantages and characteristic dangers of our democracy. It's a wonderful introduction to just thinking more deeply about how our country works and how it should work. And I think one thing I find is that all students, people agree and disagree with him to varying degrees. They all find they learn a ton from reading him, both when they agree with him and if they're arguing with him or disagreeing with him. And they all come away, I think everybody comes away from this book recognizing how American they are, how American, that even if they agree with some of his criticisms of our political system, and he has some criticisms, you definitely come away thinking, yeah, and it is still our political system. Like this is definitely us. This is the system that we have. We can try to tinker with it. We're not likely to have a radically new one anytime soon. But what can we do with it? He's very much about making the best of this situation that we're in, and trying to harvest the fruits of democracy and hold at bay as much as we can its characteristic challenges, which he thinks are very serious and in some ways potentially very scary. My study of political theory informed my work at the government every single day. I'll try to give the short version. So what did I do? I had a sabbatical fellowship in DC 6 years ago, and during that sabbatical, we had our twins and weren't in a hurry to move back to Irving if we could avoid it. So I got a year of leave from my home university, University of Dallas. We stayed in DC for an extra year, and I got government work. For half a year, I worked for Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who was then chairman of the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. House and Senate, the least important congressional committee. It's the only one that reports no legislation, I think, other than maybe the tax committee. But he was using the very fact that it didn't have to report legislation to run this amazing social science research project called the Social Capital Project, where he was really trying to get a whole bunch of smart people in the room to research what are the causes of American social decline, what is the state of our families, neighborhoods, communities, civil society, and given that state is famously not as good as it's been in the past in many respects, in exactly what respects are they declining, and what, if anything, could be done about that? What are some are there policy solutions that could strengthen marriages, strengthen communities, strengthen neighborhoods, all these sorts of things. So, I'm not a policy expert. I'm not a policy researcher, so I was helping manage the team of them. I will say, it's a true story. The fact that I teach Tocqueville every semester in my regular professor job did very much help me get that job. It's one of the few places that expertise in Tocqueville will actually get you a Washington job. But everybody knew who Tocqueville was, that he was a sort of intellectual godfather of understanding social capital and the social community networks and such that make politics possible. So definitely, my ability to quote Tocqueville from memory was relevant to that job. But I was helping keep people's projects on track and helping edit and so on. And then that was half a year, so on the legislative side, and then I spent half a year working for the executive branch at the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So I was brought in to work on some regulatory reform. I wasn't an appointee, but I was working for political appointees for the Trump administration, basically repealing some Obama-era regulations that they and we didn't like. And then halfway through that, the pandemic hit, so we suddenly found ourselves charged, since we're the civil rights office for the largest civilian federal agency, and as it happened, the agency that now had chief responsibility for managing the pandemic. We were the only federal office with jurisdiction over state ventilator rationing protocols. So we suddenly found ourselves having to answer questions like, what does federal civil rights law say about your decision about who to give the ventilator to if we run out of ventilators? So that was very high stakes seeming work at the time. Then a month later, we found out that actually ventilators were killing people with COVID, so the whole thing was sort of backwards. But at any rate, for the time that we thought that it was this life-threatening thing, it was scary and fascinating and all sorts of things at once. So, in both cases, in neither case did what I do for a living, teaching and researching political philosophy, give me any direct answers to anything that I was doing. Now, of course, that itself is something that I thought I had learned from the study of political philosophy, is that political philosophy doesn't give you direct, concrete answers to any day-to-day policy questions. So that was confirmed. But a couple of things I found that made me, in both offices, I was sort of especially the first office, there were a lot of nerds in the office, for sure. It was a very, very intellectual group. Even among them, I think I was the only professor who was actually on leave from being a professor, so sort of the nerd among nerds. And then in the executive branch office, I was almost the only non-JD. So it was basically an office of lawyers. And I was the PhD among the JDs. So in both cases, I definitely found that my study of the kind of books that you guys are reading in Hertog was quite relevant. I found the main thing that it does, that political philosophy, I think I've always thought does, and I definitely saw this, it's meant to free you from ideological blinders. And so there are certain habits of thought that we pick up from our teachers, from our social environment, from TV, from news media, whatever. Certain cliches, certain kind of ways of thinking that hem in your ability to actually see the difficult policy challenge in front of you and think about creative ways that we could at least alleviate some problem that's facing our country. I don't want to start giving examples of those cliches because left and right and various different political parties will, it's always easier to see the other guys' cliches than yours. And so as soon as you start giving examples, they start getting controversial. I'm happy to talk about, that with anybody who wants to. But just for an introduction, I would say, political philosophy is really meant to help you both ask and to the extent you can answer the biggest questions about what government is even for, why we're doing this, what a healthy society would look like, what the role of government is and can be in ensuring that healthy society. And so I think my study of political philosophy prepared me, and I think it should prepare anybody, to tackle these concrete problems as the really difficult, sometimes impossible, but really difficult challenges that they actually are, and avoid the human tendency to find ideological shortcuts and say, oh, the answer must be this because, I know this. Like, more democracy is always good. Or, the government can't affect family structure, or whatever it may be, these cliches that are never true. I mean, none of these if you can say it in one sentence, it's not fully true about politics. The reality is always more complicated than that. And I think political philosophy helps you to approach the messy, complicated reality that politics always is, while bearing in mind the actual, basic principles of what a good country is, we should be aiming for. And then you try to bridge the gap between that, the aims of politics on the one hand, including the aims of our political system as it was created by our founders and modified in the course of history on the one hand, and then this actual thing in front of us that's really hard, that even if you come up with a good solution, it's 5-1 against you getting that solution through the House and Senate. And what was a good solution in the first place? You'd have to know a ton of data, and there might not even be good data. Like, just so many challenges there. Bridging that gap is the actual work of public policy. And I don't think political philosophy can do anything to bridge that gap for you. But political philosophy can help you see clearly what those challenges are. And I do think it makes you smarter at thinking creatively about those challenges. I mean, if you've wrestled with Tocqueville and Plato and all these other authors that you guys are reading like that, you will actually be better able at looking at 3 pages of data and now thinking about which of the 10 different policy options might actually do something about these worrisome trends about, kids dropping out of school or whatever it may be. I mean, again, it doesn't provide answers, but it helps build up your brain to be the kind of person that can think hard and in detail about what those answers might actually be. And then that challenge, that's the fun of policy work. It's very different fun from the fun of studying political philosophy. I ultimately have chosen to spend my life doing the one rather than the other. I think they're both a ton of fun. They're very, very different types of fun. They're very different challenges. I think it's important not to mix them up with each other and not to think you're doing the one when doing the other. That tends to go very poorly. But I do think that each one, in a kind of roundabout way, does make you better at the other. So I think part of why I wanted to do this, I happened to find myself in DC, and if it hadn't happened that way, I would never have had this opportunity. But it had been and in fact, part of why I took the sabbatical fellowship in DC in the first place is I was hoping that I might have this chance to stay on for an extra year and work government. And if I hadn't had a family, we had our third and fourth kids, and my wife was pregnant with our fifth by the time we were coming back. If those kids hadn't been there, I would have done it for an extra year or two at least, because it was just fascinating. I learned something every single day on the job, learned something new. I do ultimately prefer teaching and reading, but it was great, and I wouldn't have given it up. But part of why I'd been feeling this hunger for the at least year or two before I took my sabbatical in DC, I was just increasingly noticing all the books that I teach, and you can start with Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, go right up through. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on St. Augustine of Hippo. Go through the great medieval political thinkers, go through the great early modern political thinkers, Grotius, Hobbes, Pufendorf, Locke, Spinoza, Rousseau. I mean, go right up through all of them. Every single one of them had significantly more experience of real world politics than I did at least, and then almost any of my friends in the political philosophy world did. The two extreme cases are Cicero and Thomas More, each of whom was basically running his respective country at the peak of his career, and still managed to write these timeless classics of political theory. But it's not just them. I mean, even somebody like Aristotle, who was not politically involved, he was buddies with Philip of Macedon. Like, he was just, they all had their finger to some extent in the hand, their finger in the pot of politics of their day, and were just involved in it and aware of it. Locke was a close advisor to Shaftesbury, who might have been the most important lord in England in the lead up to the Glorious Revolution, the constitutional change. They knew what was going on. They talked to people who were actually involved in it, and they were to varying degrees for varying amounts of time involved in it themselves. And so it just meant that when they wrote about politics, they knew firsthand what they were writing about. And I just thought, I mean, my main life's work as an academic is to understand those books better. How can I say that I understand them if I haven't spent at least some time trying to acquire some of the experience that they themselves had that allowed them to write those books? So that was very important to me. And it was confirmed for me. I mean, I did have that experience. Some of you all will be taking Xenophon's Education of Cyrus with my old grad school roommate Shiloh Brooks. I don't know whether Dr. Brooks would say the same thing. My guess is he would, but there are passages in the Education of Cyrus, in particular, among many other books, that just stand out to me now because I think it's describing people that I met in DC, where I could have articulated it beforehand, but I have the memories now of interacting with this type of person that's depicted in these ancient texts, for one way or another, and we can go into details. But I really think that, I think that political theorists often want to sell what we do by representing it as if it was more immediately relevant to political practice than I actually think that it is. On the other hand, I think that when we read these books of political theory, it's dangerous to forget how much the authors originally intended them to ultimately be, in some sense, at least in a very general way, a guide to political practice. And if you lose track of that ultimately practical import of these books, the practical intention of these books, you've lost track of what the authors actually meant them to be. And I will say, I don't want to flatter too much here, but I think the Hertog Political Studies program does an outstanding job of bringing those two things together. And bringing those two things together is the job, as I understand it, of political philosophy. Well, my advice is you should pick. I know you guys have to pick, what you're doing from week to week. I think you should pick more based on the books than on the professor. I know, some people are trying to figure out, which professor they're going to like more or agree with more. I would hate it if you came in agreeing with all of us. Also, I don't think you can. I don't think that's logically possible, given how many different points of view the 12 of us represent. But either way, I mean, you shouldn't be afraid of taking somebody who's going to challenge you one way or another. Most of you wouldn't anyways, but I think it should really be driven by what are the topics you want to learn the most about. Because that's, again, I started to say this earlier, this is what's so great about Hertog is you're in a group of people who actually are all there to learn. And who have time, this is the other thing, who have time to do the reading and think about the reading and, go for a walk for an hour and just think about the reading and argue with each other about the reading because you guys don't have to do papers, which is great too. So I think, just think about which of these topics most excites you, about which you're most excited by the prospect of spending a full week just immersing yourself in this topic. And I would say, definitely take advantage of DC while you're there. And I know, Hertog provides you guys with a bunch of different great opportunities, and don't be shy about all the different social outings that they plan for you. But, don't try to overbook your social calendar beyond what Hertog already gives you, because you guys, make plenty of time just to hang out with your fellow Hertog group and talk about whether it's the readings or life or anything else, because I really think that the friendships you build up over those 6 weeks, from what I've heard from some students, can be very special, and it's just a rare opportunity to have people who are from all over the country, some of them who are quite different from you, but who have in common that they're very interested in exactly the same things that you're very interested in. It's a really rare opportunity. Again, it's what college aims for, what college often falls short of, and it's magical for that 6 weeks. So enjoy it.